journalists need to be much more committed than ever before to impartiality.
Hola, hola, ¿cómo estás? Bienvenido. Esto es HDP, Hablemos de Política, el podcast donde semanalmente hablamos de temas relacionados con la política de los Estados Unidos. Mi nombre es Sally Lehrman, soy el host de este programa y hoy tenemos un capítulo claramente diferente porque lo vamos a hacer en inglés. El objetivo del podcast siempre es traer invitados de calidad y muy relevantes con temas de la política. Pero lamentablemente no todos se hablan español. Entonces, como hoy tenemos las ganas de hablar de un tema muy interesante como es The Trust Project, tenemos la suerte y el lujo de invitarla a Sally. Como Sally no habla español, decidimos hacerlo en inglés. Eventualmente este podcast estará traducido en Spotify, pero en YouTube va a salir una versión con los subtítulos correspondientes. Por lo cual, sin ir mucho más lejos, y ahora sí, tenemos la oportunidad, como dije hace un ratito, de poder invitarla y presentarla a Sally Lehrman. Sally, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for changing your tradition and doing this podcast in English today for me. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate the opportunity to speak to your audience because you have such an interesting audience. And so I look forward to this. And one day I hope to improve my Spanish to the level where I actually could do it in Spanish.
We are really, really happy to have you here because I think that what you're going to share with us, it's quite sure something interesting, and it's something probably revolutionary for our audience. So let's start with something simple. Can you share us who you are and what you do?
Yeah, so my name's Sally Lehrman, and I've been a journalist from very early days. It's my only career, and I mostly covered health and, really science and business topics. But I've always been someone who kind of an activist within journalism to try to help us do better and help hold ourselves to our highest values. And so it made sense for me to transition out of being a journalist, although I still hold that identity and I still do some writing, but to transition out of that and really start this trust project, which is a nonprofit effort among the news industry to really step forward and respond to the crisis of trust, the crisis of misinformation, just pervading the news, where people cannot, it's very hard for the regular person to be able to tell the difference when you're looking at your phone, when you're looking at your computer, to tell the difference between journalism that's produced with integrity and information that's maybe designed to convince you to buy a pair of shoes or to convince you to have a particular point of view or even, incite you to some sort of activity that maybe you wouldn't be doing anyway.
So I was reading on one of the posts about the Trust Project that you always mention about something you define as quality journalism. I mean, what do you mean with that?
Oh, so that's such a great question because journalism, like people, journalism is fallible, so we're not perfect, but there are fundamentals of journalism, and that's what we talk about when we mean quality journalism. And often what I use the term journalism with integrity. So journalism is different from other kinds of information because journalists aim to serve the public interest. So we're aiming, as we go out and report on stories, like when I report on science and health news, I am trying to find out as much as I can about what's going on and produce an accurate story with multiple perspectives in order that you, as a reader, as a listener, as a viewer, can make your own decisions. So I'm not saying believe this, do this, vote this way. All I'm doing is presenting accurate information that I think is important for the public to know. And that accurate is really important component. So I have developed a certain expertise myself, but I also gather information from other experts or for experts in the field and ask them, like, what should we be doing in regard to COVID-19, for example? How do we respond to this? What is a proper behavior to protect ourselves, to protect our families? So that's what quality journalism is. It's about working within certain parameters that support the public's right to know.
So if you have to define the mission of the Trust Project, what do you think it is?
Well, what we're aiming to do, so we have news organizations around the world participating in the Trust Project, and they range from very small to very large. And the goal is to help people differentiate between journalism with integrity behind it and other kinds of information, so that you'll know, can I use this information to make a decision about my own life, my community, my government, and start to rebuild trust in journalism itself and be trustworthy. That's part of it, is that we want to engage with the public. We're trying to be responsive to the public to enable just a better relationship. So our goal is to help people to build a more trustworthy press that people can see both on news pages and across the technology platforms now on which we get our news, like whether it be, Google search or Facebook or Instagram or whatever it may be.
There's something called trust indicators. Can you share with us what do you mean with that?
Yeah, so the way I began the Trust Project, I really wanted to find a way that we could make it easier for people to tell the difference between news and other kinds of information. And I also wanted to rebuild trust in the news and build this more trustworthy press. But these were not new problems. These were problems that we talked a lot about in the past among ourselves as journalists. So I wanted to do something that was really resonated with the public and bring the public in. So we went out and talked to people about what it is that they value in the news. When do they trust it and when don't they? And asked them, well, how do you decide whether something's trustworthy or not? And in the process of doing that, we heard some very similar things, like people were making very similar comments, no matter how different they were, about what they looked for. And we talked to people across race, class, gender, generation, geography, and immigration status. And so we took that information and all the various things that they were telling us, we brought it to news executives they represented 100 different companies. And then we worked with them to marry what people were looking for with these traditional values of journalism. And so out of that came the trust indicators. And the trust indicators, these are pieces of information that you and your audience will find on news stories that are participating in the Trust Project. There are also things that you could look for even when a news site's not part of the Trust Project, because they are fundamental to journalism with integrity. What are they? Well, they explain to you who and what is behind a news story. So they explain to you, kind of like I was talking about those standards, like what's behind journalism with integrity. Well, every journalism organization sticks to certain rules and standards, and they're common across the whole industry, but there might be some variations. So they should have a policy that explains their ethics, that explains like when do they have a conflict of interest and what do they do if there's a conflict of interest, like if a journalist is called upon to report on something that they're close to, or so what do they do about that? What are the rules? What are the rules around naming a source or not naming a source? What are the rules around making corrections? If you make a mistake, like everyone does, we hope not too many, but if you make a mistake, then a Trust Project news partner would make a correction and would explain in their policy statement when that happens, how to report a problem. So there's 8 of these, and I can go through each one, but there's 8, and just roughly they talk about the organization itself, and they respond to this question about what is your agenda as an organization. There's one that talks about diverse voices, and we can go into that more in detail if you like, but we heard from people. We want to hear from people, not just at high levels of business and government. We want to hear from people who are like ourselves, unlike ourselves. So we thought, well, we need to make that a trust indicator. Another one is labeling news versus opinion. So is this a news story? Is it an opinion piece? Is it analysis? Is it commercial copy? So all those things are things that people were asking for. Another one is explaining more detail about where we got our information. So we call that references. We also there's one called methods like that, where we explain more in-depth stories or more controversial stories or investigative stories. Where do we get this information? So that's called type references and methods. And then we have local. So was the reporter there? Do they know the community? Do they understand, what's happening locally? Do they have that expertise? And then there's one called, we call it actionable feedback. And what that means is that we will listen to you, like as a news organization, they're making a commitment to listen to you and to find ways to enable you to participate. So not just in comments, but to really pay attention when people have criticisms and maybe suggestions about coverage. So those are, I think, really important ways that we can not only communicate with the public more, but make ourselves better and make ourselves more trustworthy in the news media.
When you talk about trust and when you talk about transparency, one of the things that come to my mind always is that, when I study in college, what are the journalism, and always come to my mind the word objectivity. Do you really think that on these days, the way that the media is probably developing, do you think that objectivity is something that you as a journalist look forward to do it, or is something from the past?
That's such an important question. Like, we really have to think about that right now, because we are, as a member of the public, I read news and watch news and listen to news too. We are getting all kinds of information, and oftentimes it's coming from a very specific point of view. So to me, that means journalists need to be much more committed than ever before to impartiality. And I would make a distinction between impartiality and objectivity. Please. Yeah, because as just as a person in the world, we grow up, we experience the world certain ways. So your audience here speaks Spanish. I do not speak. I learned Spanish and I really love the language, but I never became very good at it. So there's a certain world that you know that I don't, which affects the way that you understand your world. And there's other things that have to do with the people that you grew up around, the families, your geography, your race, your ethnicity, all those things. So that affects, we can't help but have that affect how we look at the world. But impartiality is a different thing. Impartiality means that we make corrections for that. So if I grew up in California, I don't understand Florida that well, I'll be honest. So if I'm going to report a story on Florida, I'm going to make sure I take extra care to try to understand that, what's happening there, what is the state like, what is the communities there, what matters to people in Florida. Just to take sort of a simple example. Same thing with, we have certain values that we grow up with. We have values in our family, in our religious community. Those things, I would say, affect our ability to be objective, but they don't affect our ability to be impartial. And journalists need to be impartial. The way we do that is we look at we gather information and we talk to people and we correct for our own perspectives. And we make sure that on any issue or idea, any event even, that we talk to people who are affected by it. We talk different stakeholders, that I would say, people who have been affected by the issue, who are involved in the issue, maybe who are involved in, have some leadership of authority in that issue. So you can see there are everyone, no matter whether it's an issue or an idea or a event, we all have to think about, and especially as journalists, we have to think about, well, who has a stake in this story? we need to talk to them. And then we also have to think about our own stake that we may not even have recognized. And that's how you get to impartiality.
But, I think that's something interesting here. So traditionally, especially newspapers, digital newspapers, they are going down in terms of audience as well as revenue. Traditionally, newspapers make money on advertising. There are other ways, but they're really, really hard. A few years ago, probably one of the most prestigious newspapers in America, the Washington Post, was bought by Jeff Bezos, CEO of Amazon. Mm-hmm. So, since Amazon on these days are on the media law, they have a lot of news about them. I was wondering, if you're a journalist working for that company, how do you think they can cover the issues from Amazon, especially the ones being done right now about COVID-19 or other things, to the workers from the warehouses?
Oh, and that's such an important story, isn't it?
It is.
I mean, it's so vital. And Amazon, I think because it is such a big employer, that it's important that it's covered accurately and fairly. So news organizations this gets to those policies and practices that I was talking about. So one of the things that we ask, the Trust Project asks our news sites to do, is to be honest about disclosing ownership of the news organization. So we know that Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post. So that's really important information right there. Some news sites, if they weren't part of the Trust Project, Washington Post is a partner, by the way, they may not be as forthcoming about ownership. So that's one good thing right there, to be clear. The second thing is we ask news sites to be really think about and have clear disclosures around that conflict of interest that you're describing, where an owner may have business enterprises that would be covered or affected by coverage. And so they're required to explain that. The Washington Post says very strongly that they, and have said it several times, that they do not allow Mr. Bezos to influence coverage. And so maybe there's some questions in your mind, like, how is that really true? So at the level of the reporter, then we think about, well, what constraints have they put in place to make sure a reporter can feel confident that they can report on this story without interference. And so, I don't know enough about the Washington Post and their internal operations to be able to speak super specifically, but I can tell you that what they should have, I'm sure they do have layers of editors. And so the reporter is reporting to an editor, and then part of the job of the editor is to protect that editor from the corporate influence. And they take that job very seriously. So when I worked for a small, it's not that small, but a regional newspaper in San Francisco, that came up particularly with because I was in the business section. So we would have advertisers, and we're reporting on the advertisers. And sometimes we're reporting in ways that the advertisers don't like. So it was the job of the editor and the publisher even to protect us as reporters and tell the retailer, no, we're not going to report in a way that's favorable to you. You're not buying that as part of the advertisers. And one little story around that, in San Jose, California, the newspaper had a whole series, I believe, a special, let's say, on used car dealers. And it was very, negative on used car dealers. They found some things that were very negative. And so the used car dealers were very angry, and they said, if you're going to continue this kind of coverage, we're going to pull all of our ads. And at that time, the used car dealer ads were very important to the paper. But the paper recognized that the public trust is really what keeps that paper alive. It's not, there are other ways to get funds. So they said, okay, go ahead and pull your advertisements. And they did. They did pull it, but the paper continued. And I think that's where where journalism is different, where we know that we do not have a product, if you will, like we cannot exist if we don't have the public trust. So if we allow those barriers to break down, then we lose your trust. and there's really no reason for us to exist. So we try to put things in place to create very strong divisions between potential influences and the journalistic staff and the reporting.
Well, I think may make a lot of sense. And actually that's, well, I mean, I think that the industry is going to, not only the media publishers, but also other kind of industry is moving forward to this idea of consumers paying directly for what they want. In terms of, I mean, I have on my mind what is doing the New York Times. They have, I think it's, the last time I checked was 4.5, almost 500,000, almost 5 million users that regularly paid every week for the content. Do you think that's the future of the journalism? The way that the moving a little away from advertising and getting membership revenue?
Well, I think that a lot of news organizations are thinking very carefully about that and are really interested in the idea. And the reason for that is because advertising has become so much less reliable and really has hurt. I mean, the lack of advertising has really hurt the news industry. And there's two reasons why that's happening. One is that with the platforms distributing most of the news, so Google and Facebook in particular, they are absorbing all the ad dollars. So like 90%, I heard one editor say, of their ad dollars were going to Google now instead of to the news site. So that's one reason. The second reason is that advertisers have become increasingly worried about being placed next to stories that they consider upsetting to the public. And so, or maybe also that could be accidentally hyperpartisan or accidentally not in news, but accidentally on these websites put next to a hyperpartisan or fake news, even though I shouldn't use that word, or misinformation. So, advertisers are pulling away, and the Trust Project, we hope to bring back some of that because we're bringing together a group of news organizations that are saying, committing to be operating with integrity. So I think that will help. But in general, news organizations are realizing that they need to find a new business model. And the idea of the public paying for the news directly through, and it builds a stronger relationship with the public. And I think that's a good thing. What it can do is make it more difficult for people who have more difficult economic circumstances to access quality news. And that part worries me. So I think we're going to have to come up with some solution there. But overall, I think it's a good trend, and I think we'll see more of it.
So you just mentioned the word or the sentence fake news. You said that it's not correct. So how do you define a misleading news or something that is, let's say, not correct? Yeah.
So, and misleading, misinformation. So words like misleading news or misinformation, pretending to be news, those kind of words are more, or those descriptions, I think, are more accurate because it's about, again, I mean, it's more literally, it's an organization or information that's pretending to be news. And it might have the same form of a news story. It might even today look a lot like a news story, but it doesn't have any of the fundamentals behind it. And so we see a whole range there. We see, especially now with the social media and with concerns about the new coronavirus, we see a lot of things that would just be rumor really being spread around. And so that's one thing that very dangerous, because we could accidentally, we could make a lot of mistakes and get infected or maybe get really sick as a result of that. Then there's things that are deliberately designed to that are deliberately wrong and designed to convince you of something that's not true. And that would be disinformation. So it's deliberately put out there to try to convince the public that something that is not true is true and maybe influencing things like our vote. And then in the middle would be misinformation, where it's wrong. So it's not a mistake. It's not like rumor, and it's not deliberately designed to disinform, but it is not produced, let's say, with the standards and the values behind real journalism. And so it's telling people something that is in error.
You mentioned before that traditional journalism, you have the reporter, you have the editor, and then you have the publisher. So I don't know if this continues, this applies also for these new digital websites. But my question is this. So in terms of audience, in terms of getting the most traffic, and in terms of how we can get the consumers or the readers to go in actually to the website, they're using a lot of tricks, mostly called clickbaits. Do you consider using a clickbait some kind of fake news?
Yeah, I love that question, because this gets to really the reason why I started the Trust Project. Because when I first started the Trust Project, or let's say years before I started the Trust Project, I had, I told you I was kind of an activist in journalism. So I was involved in this organization called the Society for Professional Journalists. And I was a chair or president of our local chapter or regional chapter. And I brought together a bunch of editors to talk about how news was affected by the digital environment. And everyone was very worried about what would happen and concerned about the way news quality was declining in the digital space. And then I brought some of the same people together much later, like right at the time I started the Trust Project, and they were concerned about the same things. And one of the people that I had invited was the person who invented the idea of showing police mugshots on news pages. And there was another person there who was showing celebrity shots. And this was in the late, it was in around 2012, 2013. And the woman who did the mugshot, she said, I wish I had never come up with that. I mean, the idea was to get people to click on that page. But it was a terrible idea because it was promoting stereotypes. That is the very worst thing, that it was, putting people who had been arrested, they weren't even actually tried for a crime, and then just showing a series of people. And of course, because we know about who police targets, it was mostly Black and brown faces that people would see. So she regretted that. And so that was part of the reason. And listening to her, I thought, we can't let this continue. We can't let the digital environment, the mobile phones or computer news on computers through Google or Facebook, we can't let that degrade the quality of news and dictate how we operate. So yes, I think we are continuing to, rebel against that tendency where we're competing with everything else. A lot of it really is junk that you see that looks like news. It's just junk meant to attract your attention. So we've got to, as a news industry, I think we're a little bit vulnerable to that, because many news sites, they use a service called Outbrain, and there's another one where it's at the bottom. You're looking at a news feed, and at the very bottom, it will show kind of silly stories or dramatic stories or things about like how to lose weight, and those aren't real news stories. They're clickbait, and yet and news companies get money from that, and they really shouldn't use them at all because it's too confusing. It's not journalism, and they know that.
No, yeah, exactly. And and the reason I think why they're using is because they're making money. But I think there's a point where you have to choose. Again, you have to prioritize what you're going to choose: your audience or the revenues.
Yeah, and I think we're going to see that go away over time. And I just want to be clear to everyone that it's like the news staff doesn't produce those. Then it's separate. It's produced by, I don't know, the company, I guess, that owns Outbrain, or maybe different services that they use. But either way, the problem is it's confusing. And news organizations, I don't quite think they don't understand how serious it is.
Well, so I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, but in sports media, this is happening for, I think, a few years. They are using basically artificial intelligence to writing stories about sports results. So I don't know, the game from Miami Heat versus LA Lakers, they just finished, and at the second is finished, they already have the story written down, and they can do that not because they have this technology that they do it, and basically what the technology is doing is that they are checking facts and writing automatically the story. So my question is, do you think that this is going to happen on other kind of journalism? And are you afraid about this? Because that's a challenge.
Yeah, well, if you don't mind, I'd like to ask you, like, do you think people are bothered by that? Like, if they see a sports story that's written partly by a machine, is that troubling?
I think that's a great question. So, no, I think that the answer is no. I think that most of the consumers, they're just going to see how a result from their favorite sports, if the team won, and going directly to. I was reading a few days ago something interesting regarding this, that there's sports such as basketball where something's happening all the time, but the other sports like football where there's a lot of minutes between the goals. Well, the thing is this: the report that I was reading, it says that Centennials and Generation Z, they basically go to the highlights and they don't care about they don't care about watching like 3 hours of sport. They want to have only the highlights. So answer your question, yeah, probably that consumer, they don't care who write the note or who write the story. They are just looking to read it. So that's something, I don't know. I mean, I'm 41 years old. I enjoy reading newspapers and enjoy reading quality journalism. However, I'm afraid that this could go against the quality that you mentioned before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it's a great question. I mean, I love all your questions, actually. Clearly, you've really thought a lot about this, and I appreciate that. Yes, I think we will see more of it, but not to the point where it starts to undermine real journalism. What I'm seeing, and we talk to news organizations around the world because they're all part of the Trust Project. So we have news partners in Europe, in Latin America, in US, and Canada primarily. And what we're learning is that, yes, we're seeing this, what I would call machine-generated journalism, and it's either like some part of the story or all of it. Sometimes that's more rare. Usually it's some part of it. We're seeing it happening in sports and sometimes in business, because those are the places where you see more predictable events. So with the economic pressures on journalism, and also just with what's possible now with artificial intelligence, news companies are moving to this model where maybe some of the more predictable events will be reported through this machine-readable journalism, not machine-readable, machine-produced journalism. It's almost always is checked by a staff member. I know Associated Press does this too, sometimes with stories. And so what we've done is we've asked our news sites, we've just starting to do this because of the change, we're asking them to be really clear when you see a machine-generated story on a page. So the sports story that you're talking about would say on the page, this is partially machine-generated. We have one of our sites is kind of a semi-tabloid in the UK, and they want to put a label that says produced by machines, checked by humans, or produced by robots, produced by robots, checked by humans. So we want them to put more clear labels, and I think we'll see more, but it will primarily be in areas that don't require a lot of reporting like I was describing earlier. So reporting across different stakeholders, different perspectives. A game happens, there's certain steps that are fairly predictable. Stock market reports, pretty much fairly predictable, even though the market's not predictable, but the way you report it's predictable.
And how about politics in terms of polls?
Oh, you mean reporting polls and through using a machine? I haven't seen that yet. I think we could actually. It's an interesting thought because we could see it. And kind of what's interesting about this trend is what that does is free up the reporters to do the analysis. So hopefully, what this will lead to is kind of that basic, more rote work can be done by the machine, the robot, and then the human can come in and really provide that part that the public really benefits from, the analysis, the interpretation.
No, I mean, I think that could be interesting. But also, my question here could be: do you think that if the newspaper has the agenda aligned to some politician, do you think that these media players can help to build this politician image?
Can a newspaper? Yeah. So this gets to impartiality and it gets to independence. So when we talk about news organizations or talk to news organizations about joining, we're really clear. We want you to be independent from political influence. We want you to be independent from your owner's influence. So business interests influence, different from just trying to make enough revenue to pay for your reporters, pay everybody's salary. So this is where the difference between journalism with integrity and new organizations that might produce news but don't really have integrity, that's the difference. And this is where it's so important to look for those kinds of disclosures on a news site. You'll see it on a Trust Project news site, but people should look for it everywhere. Like, can you tell from looking at this site, is it funded by actually not by an organization that's meant to produce news, but an organization that's a campaign for a candidate or a political party, whatever side of the equation they're on? Is it funded by, and are they being honest? Like, can you tell? Are they being transparent about who's funding it, who owns it, who's the leadership behind it? And there is a distinction. A newspaper worth its salt is not going to be promoting, other than on its editorial and opinion pages, they are not going to be promoting in their particular candidate.
No, I mean, I agree with you. I think that's the right thing to do, and to be honest and transparent to the consumer. So I'd like to ask, so you're probably a really busy woman with a lot of things going on. So how do you manage to keep yourself informed?
Well, I love to be informed. And I think when it gets right down to it, like even in our interviews I told you about with all the different types of people, we interview people who are really, really busy. And everybody appreciated the importance of understanding what's going on in your local community, understanding what's going on at a national level. And increasingly, it's so important to know what's going on globally. And I know your audience in particular probably is very interested in what's happening globally. So what I do is I do subscribe to newspapers, and I get the paper version because I enjoy sitting down and just looking at it, having it around, picking it up when I have a few moments. And I spend a lot of time on the screen, so I don't want to, like on videos, I don't want to spend more time reading my news there. I know that's kind of different from some people. So I have like my favorite. I think we should, I think about what's the best news diet that I really should have. And so I care about what's happening locally. So I should subscribe. I don't, but I pay attention to our little local newspaper. It's called the Half Moon Bay Review and Pescadero Pebble. Pay attention to that. I pay attention to, in New York Times, I subscribe to them, but I also pay attention to the Washington Post. And then I have my Android phone. I just told you I don't rely too much on news there, but I do glance. I've developed a habit where I'll just scroll through the headlines at the beginning and the end of the day, or if I have a few moments. I don't think that's the best way to get news, because the algorithm's not working very well for me. So I think it would be better maybe if I subscribe to like an app from NPR, an app from, just news sites that can kind of give me different perspectives from a regional standpoint, from a national, global, and so on. And just pick the ones. And just one of the things I think people worry about when they read the news, and I know I'm victim to this, is I think I have to read everything. And so then I don't do it because it feels like, oh my God, like here's this newspaper, I read every single page, I spent all day at it and still feel like I'm not done. So it's more like thinking about what interests me. And so I'll go look for what things that just kind of catch my eye. And then what things really should I know? So there have been some very huge events lately, like what happened in Beirut, was that yesterday? Yep. That I feel like I need to be informed. So I'm going to try and find different perspectives on that bit of news so I really understand what happened. So that's a long answer, but...
No, that's a good one. So is there anything that I didn't ask that I want to share with our audience?
Well, I think that, I guess I would say that one of the reasons I started the Trust Project is that as a journalist, I really believe in the principles of journalism, and I believe in that public service mission. So, and that involves engagement with the public. So it's not just journalists out there saying, having fun reporting on this or that. It really is fun. But it's about engaging with the public and having that relationship and listening. And so that means that as a journalist, I need to be open to the public and listening, but it also means that the public plays a role. And so I want your audience to know that if they're unhappy with the news, if they think there's news, like they don't see themselves in the news and they want to see more coverage of issues that's relevant to them, then it's really important to speak up and not just turn it off or stop listening because, it doesn't represent me. I understand that feeling, but we need you. We need you to tell us when we're doing wrong, what we're doing right. Because journalism is about helping the public know what's going on in the world, make better decisions. And as part of that, the public plays a really critical role.
Well, Sally, I really, really appreciate you coming here. I thank you a lot for expressing and sharing everything on the project. I think what you're doing is something great, and I'm really looking forward to have more players, more newspapers join your project.
Well, thank you. We have 200 sites now, and we're growing in Latin America. I want your users to know. And I hope we can get more ethnic media, too, in the U.S. And so I really appreciate the time today and your interest and the opportunity.
Thanks a lot. So for you, the one who are here, the one that are listening to us, this is to help us grow in this project. It's really, really important for us to ask you to subscribe, to share this with your friends. So please, this is the only way we're gonna continue or gonna keep growing this project. So thanks a lot, and we'll see you next week. Bye.